life and death fights, heavily armed fights, to the wonder and disbelief and heartache of new love. Because of Heller's careful building of the wary friendship between Higg and Bangley, even Bangley came to sort of earn my affection by the end, and my respect for his constant focus on survival at all costs. And all of this Heller does without an extraneous keystroke. There's just nothing superfluous in this book. Every handcrafted word contributes to the whole, and this whole is a sad and beautiful, but ultimately hopeful look at the possibilities that life holds when everything we know and love is gone. And if you need more of an endorsement, I will say that I chose to read this book twice, which is something I never do, and I loved it both times. So, The Dog Stars by Peter Heller.
Thank you, Karen. Beth.
So my name is Beth Radcliffe, and this fall, my son had the opportunity to study abroad in London, and I took that that opportunity to be able to visit him in London at the end of the term, and then we traveled together to Sicily. So being another book person, I chose to try to read all I could that took place in Sicily, about Sicily, whatever I could find. So that's what my list is about. It's books about Sicily. But it does not include guidebooks. It includes old books, new books, classics, like The Leopard by Giuseppe di Lampedusa. And it includes biographies, travelogues, novels, and mysteries. The most heartwarming of these was the 1945 Pulitzer Prize winner, The Bell for Adano by John Hersey. Now, Hersey was a war correspondent during World War II, and he was stationed in Italy, and he wrote this near the end of the war. It's about a small town in Sicily that's being run by the American Allies after they take over the island. In it, Hersey relates how the absurdity of military life and bureaucracy, while also humanizing the American occupation through one character, Major Giopolo, who has become the wartime mayor of Adano of the book's title. This is not highfalutin language. In fact, most of it's dialogue, and most of the dialogue is slang. That vino, Captain, it's murder. It'll give you the GI trots every time. By the way, there's also a lot of cursing. If that bothers you, don't go to this book. Like the dialogue, the people are ordinary people. And it's in this ordinariness that Hersey sees the humor of life. This is a book about humanity, how we wish armies behaved in occupied territories, and how they sometimes do behave. After all, Major Giopolo is based on a real major in the American Army. Fiction reader likes would be Joseph Heller's Catch-22. Catch-22 is more harsh, more sardonic, and The Bell for Adano is much more lighthearted, much more charming. Another one would be Reardon Brooks' The Aftermath, about a colonel who is taking over Hamburg after the war, and that has the same theme of the best of humanity. And nonfiction read alike, The Unraveling, High Hopes and Missed Opportunities in Iraq, was published in 2015, that's just this past year, and it's by Emma Skye, a representative of the Coalition Authority in Kirkuk. She is knowledgeable about the region, and like Giopolo, she is trying to help an area that's been traumatized by war. So again, that's John Hersey's A Bell for Adano.
Thank you, Beth. Kristy?
My name is Kristy Lockhart, and my list and my particular brand of literary catnip is what I would call meta books, so books about books. And I like these kinds of books for a number of reasons. I like the amount of research that the characters in those books tend to do. I like the fact that there's inevitably a line like, to the library. And I mostly love how a very talented author can put into words how I myself feel about how precious books are. So my list contains both fiction and nonfiction titles, but I'm going to start with a fiction title. This is The Book of Speculation by Erica Swyler, which came out just this past year. This is her debut novel, and it's a novel about family, about illusion, and most importantly, about the power of a single book. The main character in this book, Simon Watson, is a struggling librarian His house is crumbling around him. His family is dead and gone. His parents have both passed away. His mother, in fact, was what was called a circus mermaid. So she made her fortune by holding her breath for long periods of time. And she ironically drowned herself in the Long Island Sound when Simon was a child. His sister Enola has run off to be a medium for a carnival. Circuses are clearly a theme in this book. Simon, in contrast to his sister, is in stasis. So he goes nowhere, he does nothing. He doesn't even stop his house from sort of beginning to crumble into the water below. All of this changes for Simon when one day a mysterious book appears on his doorstep. It's from a bookseller that he's never met, and it appears to be a waterlogged record of a circus owner from the 1700s. It reports strange happenings in the circus troupe at the time, and Simon is very, very disturbed to discover that one of the strange happenings, the death of the circus's mermaid, it turns out that she's actually an ancestor of his. And he, as he digs further, discovers that all of the women on his mother's side of the family have actually killed themselves by drowning on the same day, July 24th, all the time. And he becomes very obsessed with this because he becomes determined that his sister is going to be the next victim of this curse on his family. She sort of shows up displaying some very disturbing personality traits. So he decides that the only thing that can prevent this is if he discovers where the book comes from and what power it holds over his family. Swyler in this book, despite it being a debut, really builds tension masterfully. She pulls her characters towards what seems like a very inevitable sense of doom. And most interestingly in this book, the modern day story of Simon and Enola is actually alternated in chapters with the original story of the Book of Speculation, which is the story of a love between a wild boy and the circus mermaid, a heartbroken medium, and an ambitious but well-meaning circus owner. And that story is, I really think, just as compelling as Simon's story. And in fact, because you know that those characters are doomed, it really builds your anxiety for the characters in Simon's story. This is a really melancholy and engrossing book, not unlike Water for Elephants by Sarah Gruen. And of course, there's the circus themes. Magic is woven with reality. I wouldn't call this a fantasy novel, but I would say that it's got a touch of magical realism, and the real is really woven with the unreal. Water and paper, I would say, are the dominant themes of this book, which is sort of funny because they're natural enemies, but I would say that here she sort of lovingly binds them. In a later scene in the book, which was particularly heartbreaking for me as a librarian, Simon takes refuge from a storm in his former workplace, the public library, and he has to make very difficult decisions about which materials to sacrifice to save the most precious collections. I know, it's really stressful. And in it, she sort of talks, she has a particular line that really struck me, where she says, "A librarian remembers the particular scent of glue and dust. And if we're so lucky, and I was, the smell of parchment, a quiet tanginess, softer than wood pulp or cotton rag, we would bury ourselves in books until flesh and paper became one and ink and blood at last ran together," which, as a librarian, I can't say I feel that strongly, but I thought it really demonstrated a particular dedication to reading. She really here, water can be purifying in this book, but it's also the destroyer of knowledge. It's the eraser of history. And I made my list particularly because I think at its heart, this book is really a love letter to books and to libraries. One of my very favorite lines in this book is, she says, "Once you've held a book and really loved it, you forever remember the feel of it, its specific weight, and the way it sits in your hand." And I think that really sums up how many of us feel. So that's, again, The Book of Speculation by Erica Swyler.
Thank you, Kristy.
You ate library paste as a child, didn't you?
She had to. It was running in her veins. So one of my choices and this is my top choice for 2015's fiction, is Canadian musician's debut. And this is Emma Hooper's Etta and Otto and Russell and James. In a Publishers Weekly interview, Emma Hooper said, "Like dancing and architecture, which function on two very different levels of communication, music has its own kind of language, one that can't be objectively interpreted, as can words or pictures, but a language no less. This debut is focused on the musicality of language. It's got spare, evocative prose. She does a wonderful job of seamlessly interweaving accounts of the present-day lives with the stories of their pasts and how they first connected with each other. It's a Canadian odyssey. An 82-year-old Etta has never seen the ocean. So one morning she wakes up. She takes a rifle, some chocolate, and her best boots, and she begins walking the 3,232 kilometers from rural Saskatchewan to Halifax. Her husband Otto wakes to a note left in the kitchen table. So this is the note she wrote. Otto, the letter began in blue ink. I've gone. I've never seen the water, so I've gone there. Don't worry. I've left you the truck. I can walk. I will try to remember to come back. Yours, in parentheses, always, Etta. Underneath the letter, she had left a pile of recipe cards, all the things she had always made, also in blue ink, so he would know what and how to eat while she was away. So Otto's brother, Russell, has loved Etta from afar for over 60 years, and he says, I'm going to go find her, and he does. He goes off on an odyssey of his own. Etta walks thousands of miles to her destination, and 3 touching stories unfold as it occurs. Otto is from a family of 14 brothers and sisters. Russell, who was an abandoned boy who lived next door to Otto, becomes a de facto member of that family. And Etta, who lost her sister at a very young age. Now, Hooper, with great insight for someone who is writing her first novel especially, explores the interactions and connections between spouses and friends and reveals the extraordinary lengths to which people will go in the name of love. And this novel dips in and out of reality and travels between past and present, creating what Etta tells Otto is just a long loop. She draws on wisdom and whimsy of astonishing grace and maturity writing this book. It's an irresistibly enchanting debut novel that explores with a very fresh lens love, old and new, the loyalty of animals, the dependency of humans, the horrors of war and perils of loneliness, and the tenacity of time and fragility of memory, and ultimately taking the journey of a lifetime. It is sweet, it is funny, and quietly powerful, a story whose dreamlike quality lingers long after the last page is turned. It's definitely for people who like to read good literary fiction, but it reminded me very much when I first started reading it of Kent Harriff's Plainsong, mostly because of the spare, evocative language and the place that was so real there, just as it is in this particular novel. And also Rachel Joyce's The Unlikely Pilgrimage of Harold Fry. So that's my choice for 2015, Etta and Otto, Russell and James by Emma Hooper.
And it's also very good on audio.
Thank you. And now Jeff is going to talk about some more warm places.
I need my glasses. So my second book tonight is a fiction book instead of nonfiction. It's called Killed at the Whim of a Hat by Colin Cotterill, and it was published in 2012. My coworkers kind of know that I'm somewhat of a reluctant mystery reader. I'm not an obsessive mystery reader. I tend to read them very selectively, and as you can probably imagine, I tend to prefer mysteries that have a very strong sense of place. And at this time of year, I want that place to be warm. Colin Cotterill is one of my favorite mystery writers, partly because of his incredibly well-crafted writing, his very literary writing, and also because of the location where his novels are set, which is primarily Southeast Asia, Laos, and Thailand. And he has actually lived in Thailand for, I think, close to 20 years now. So even though he's originally American, that's where he ended up. Or he could be British, now I'm forgetting. So his first and much longer series, I think there's 10 or 12 novels in that series, is the Dr. Siri Paiboon series. Dr. Siri Paiboon is an elderly and kind of reluctant medical examiner in Laos in the 1970s. And he is occasionally inhabited by a shaman from 1,000 years ago who sometimes helps him solve the mysteries. So there's a little magical realism in those. They're very serious. There's a little funny to them, but I highly recommend that series for something a little bit different. But what the series I'm going to talk about tonight is shorter. He's only written 3. This is the first of them, but I highly recommend that other one as well. This newer series focuses on contemporary Thailand, which is where Cotterill lives now. And it's completely the other side of the world from the Mediterranean. So it's humid, hot, tropical. And his books manage to mix kind of, what I like about them is that they mix that sort of wry, quirky humor, but underneath it all, there's still a very strong sense of the current